Good afternoon and good evening for some. Thank you for joining us for this critical conversation on the empty promise of democracy when sexual and reproductive health and rights are limited or denied. President Biden's Summit for Democracy comes at a critical time globally as we are seeing a rise of authoritarianism, a backsliding on human rights, and a weakening of civil society. While the US is the host of this week's summit, the US is not an exception to this trend. Make no mistake, democracy in the US is at risk. But this is also a time of hope and opportunity when people are coming together to hold their governments accountable and demand their voices be heard. That the US is hosting this summit is a positive sign that some governments are listening and are ready to do more to strengthen and advance democracy. I'm Sarah Sippel, Chief Global Advocacy Officer at Fòs Feminista, an international alliance for sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. I'm speaking to you today from Washington, D.C., the traditional land of the Anacostan people of the Piscataway tribe. On behalf of Fòs Feminista, I want to thank the Global Justice Center and the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. for co-hosting today's dialogue on the margins of the Summit for Democracy. I also want to thank and introduce Seema Jalan, who will facilitate today's conversation. Seema is the Executive Director of the Universal Access Project and Policy at the United Nations Foundation, a multi-stakeholder initiative of philanthropists, advocates, and companies striving for a world where all people can realize their sexual and reproductive health and rights. For close to 2 decades, Seema has promoted gender equity and girls' and women's health and human rights globally. Thank you for joining us, Seema. I now have the privilege to introduce Catherine Baird, Canada's Deputy Head of Mission to the United States of America in Washington, D.C., who will deliver our opening remarks today. Canada is a global leader when it comes to a feminist approach to foreign policy and assistance, and a champion of sexual and reproductive health and rights. We are honored to have their support for this event. Unfortunately, Ms. Baird had a conflict and is not able to join us in person, but has graciously provided us with recorded remarks. And so it's my honor and privilege to introduce Canada's Deputy Head of Mission to the United States of America in Washington, D.C., Ms. Catherine Baird.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. It's a pleasure to co-host today's important discussion with leading experts on the role of sexual and reproductive health and rights in democracies. Il me fait plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui pour cette importante discussion avec des sommités spécialisées dans le rôle que joue la santé sexuelle et reproductive dans nos démocraties. As you may know, since Canada first introduced its Feminist International Assistance Policy in 2017, we have been a fervent advocate and supporter of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Canada's feminist approach applies both to our domestic policies as well as to our international assistance and foreign policies. We are grounded in the belief that promoting rights-based, open, and inclusive societies is not only the right thing to do, it is an effective way to foster prosperity, peace, and stability, key elements of democracy. Canada's feminist approach aims to be inclusive and reflective of the diverse experiences of people who are affected by our policies, programs, and initiatives. Our feminist approach also seeks to redistribute power, another key element in support of democracy. Our work globally to support sexual and reproductive health and rights acknowledges that no woman should be forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term, and no woman should die because of pregnancy or childbirth. The foundation of a fair and equal world for women and girls in all their diversity is the right to make decisions about their own bodies. Women everywhere should have the right to safe, legal abortion, maternal and obstetric health care, comprehensive sexuality education, and contraception. But right now, across the world, including in parts of Canada and the United States, women and girls are still denied full sexual and reproductive rights and freedoms. Increased sexual and gender-based violence and the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on women's economic empowerment, makes the need to secure gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights more pressing than ever. Lockdowns and pressure on educational institutions and health services during the COVID-19 pandemic have made it even more challenging for women and girls around the world to access essential health services, information and products such as contraception, resulting in increased pregnancies and reduced access to abortion, even in countries where the procedure is legal and has clear medical guidelines to ensure it takes place safely. A shadow pandemic of increased sexual and gender-based violence has also severely compromised women's and girls' access to their full human rights, including their integrity and bodily autonomy. We know that attacks on reproductive rights are often spearheaded by well-funded, well-organized lobby groups who finance anti-abortion drives around the world. This also has an adverse effect on democracy because without sexual and reproductive health and rights, women and girls often cannot participate and contribute to society in the ways they would otherwise choose. As we close the second year of the global pandemic, Canada remains concerned that the situation facing women and girls will only get worse unless we act now to protect sexual and reproductive health and rights. Global advocacy platforms have pushed for a global campaign of factual and unbiased information at a minimum, so women and girls know their rights and have access to accurate information about their healthcare options. Economic independence is also critical as it helps ensure women can make decisions over their own bodies, including being supported to have the children they want, when they choose, and with whom they choose to have them, and to have them safely. We know that policies that restrict access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights harm the people that need this the most, and that in countries where bodily autonomy is most restricted, democracy is less stable. When we empower women and girls, we empower their families and their future children. We empower communities. We empower nations. Ultimately, we help eradicate poverty and strengthen democracy. This approach is equipping Canada, and indeed other countries that put this into practice, to address urgent global challenges, including recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, inequality within and among societies, rising populism and authoritarianism, violent conflict, and the effects of climate change. Canada is committed to supporting access to the full range of sexual and reproductive health services and information. Our international assistance supports strengthening national health systems, investing in family planning and contraceptives, comprehensive sexuality education, prevention and responses to sexual and gender-based violence, and supporting a woman's right to choose safe and legal abortion and access to post-abortion care. We work alongside many like-minded partners in these efforts. The United States is the largest donor to global health, including for family planning and HIV/AIDS globally. Canada welcomes the inclusion of sexual and reproductive health and rights in policies, both domestic and international, as we know that investments in sexual and reproductive health services are some of the most cost-effective interventions that have benefits far beyond the health sector. However, there is still more to do, and Canada looks forward to the opportunity to explore how we can work even more closely with the United States in order to protect the rights of women and girls around the world. Restricting bodily autonomy and access to reproductive health and rights doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is linked to a wider loss of rights, equity, and justice. All partners in global health should ensure that their policies are based in science and evidence, so those who need care can receive it. When people can choose whether or when to have a child, they are able to determine their own future, which is what we should all be able to do. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to participate in today's event. Merci encore une fois d'être avec nous aujourd'hui.
As Sarah mentioned, my name is Seema Jalan. I'm the Executive Director of the Universal Access Project at the UN Foundation, and I'm so delighted to be your moderator today and to be joining all of you. I have to say, this is the first time I've been a part of a conversation that is explicitly around the connection between our sexual and reproductive health and rights and a thriving democracy. And it's about time. So I'm really thankful to the Government of Canada, the Global Justice Center, Fòs Feminista, our speakers, and everyone participating today for really coming together for such a critical and timely conversation. And on the heels of the White House Summit for Democracy, no less. So let's dive in. I'll get some housekeeping portions out of the way. We'll start with, an open question to all of our panelists and hear from everyone, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. And of course, we'll then hear from our audience. And if you have a question, please ask it through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and pop in questions at any time. We will be monitoring them. And if you want to pose your question to one of the panelists specifically, please note that. And also, please make sure to note your preferred language in the interpretation bar at the bottom of your screen, as we will have translation throughout. And now I really have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed speakers. I'm pleased to welcome Helena Akilah, the Southern Africa Gender Justice Program and Policy Manager for Oxfam. Welcome. She's a feminist and women's rights activist in Mozambique with over 10 years of experience in managing gender justice and women's rights programs. Amanda Nunes, youth leader of ENIS. Amanda Nunes is a lawyer and youth leader at ENIS, the Institute of Bioethics in Latin America, notably the first of its kind, and at the Cravina Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Law Clinic at the University of Brasilia, Brazil. Welcome. She is also a master's student in law at the university. Akilah Radhakrishnan, president of the Global Justice Center. Akilah leads the center's work to achieve gender equality and human rights. In her time at the center, she has led the development of groundbreaking legal work on both abortion access in conflict and the role that gender plays in genocide. Akilah is a globally recognized voice, regularly advising governments and multilateral institutions and major media outlets. Thanks so much for joining us. And Sarah Sippel, Chief Global Advocacy Officer for Fòs Feminista, an organization she helped co-create, and she co-leads the Global Advocacy for Change Unit, advancing policy solutions that address the health and human rights of women, girls, and gender diverse people. She's been a leader in this field for over 20 years and was president of the Center for Health and Gender Equity for 14 years, was a commissioner for the International AIDS Society Lancet Commission on the Future of Global Health and HIV, and was a member of the official US delegation to the UN high-level meeting on HIV and AIDS. Well, thank you everyone for making the time to join us. Let's dive right in to our discussion, and with a question for all of our panelists. When I mentioned to someone in the foreign policy field, a senior person, that I was participating in this event, that person was genuinely baffled as to why there was a connection between sexual and reproductive health and rights and democracy. And we all know that today and tomorrow in the United States, the White House is convening a summit with 3 named themes: defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting against corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. Can each of you explain how you see sexual and reproductive health and rights connected to these pillars and why they are essential to democracy? So Helen, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you so much, Seema. Good afternoon and good night. For us, it's good night. It's 7 o'clock in night in Mozambique. This is an honor and privilege for Oxfam, for me to be here. I've been involved in this debate since 2018. I already have meetings with Senate members. So this is just a follow-up work that I'm doing with a lot of pleasure. So when we first heard about Mexican City policy in Mozambique, we were baffled. First, there was a lot of confusion in understanding why we have this policy and why this policy is affecting us. And it was crystal clear, because of this confusion and the environment of discrimination that was created, because this policy in Mozambique only is affecting the civil society organization from Mozambique. So civil society organization from United States are not affected. So the environment of discrimination between the two type of organizations were there. So, and the other thing that almost immediately was asked by many civil society organizations is, how come Mozambique has their priority set and have to change it because a government that is not Mozambican has come with aid that's supposed to be free from any strings and is making us changing our priorities. So our sovereignty was threatening. And we saw that and the lack of openness to discuss whichever topic that is related with the Gag Rule showed us that this was a mandatory and an imposition from a stronger government to a less stronger government that was Mozambique. So the issue of sexual and reproductive rights and health, the access of sexual and reproductive health topic was immediately connected with our democracy, with the sovereignty of a country and the strings attached to aid coming from the US government. So when we talk about these discussions that are going to happen so soon, this is so timely that we discuss how through these discussions are and linked to the foreign aid policy of the US government. So it has all to do with, so the SRHR issues linked to the global policy has all to do with democracy. And for us, it was a very topic that we discussed, and how it affected the ability of the country, the ability of the Mozambican people to defend and to ensure that access to sexual and reproductive health and rights was a reality in Mozambique, because we were receiving funds from the US government. Thank you.
That's so well said, Helen. And like, why would another government comment on people's bodies and lives and decision making? Yes. So thank you for that. Amanda.
Boa tarde, boa noite para quem tiver.
Hello, good afternoon and good evening, if it's evening where you are. It's a pleasure to be here talking about such an important topic with you, particularly in this moment where we are seeing the consequences of the services of sexual and reproductive health rights that are not being treated as essential during the pandemic. And to us, the relationship between democracy and sexual and reproductive rights is that there is no way to talk about democracy if people cannot have access to essential democratic rights like right to health and the autonomy of their own bodies in terms of their reproductive ability or their sexuality. When those rights are reduced, that ends up affecting the access to economic and social rights and would impede women and girls to finalize and to achieve their life projects and future projects, because they cannot handle and manage their own reproductive ability. And that also has an impact on the possibility to participate in democratic processes. So when you have policies that are impeding the needs of women and girls to be brought to democratic debates and defending the right to abortion, for instance, this is extremely severe, extremely grave, and this is also providing legitimacy to violence in debates, for instance, like what's happening in Brazil, what we are going through, because we have a lot of difficulties to speak about those issues, and a lot of people who speak out are affected and are persecuted, like representatives and policymakers who talk about this issue, like Denise, for instance. And in Brazil, it had a symbolic impact that was very severe, which is enforcing this kind of policy that would restrict debates on the rights to abortion and sexual and reproductive rights, and that ends up providing legitimacy to political decisions in the country in terms of removing sexual and reproductive health or access to health in terms of those who know the needs of women and girls, democratically speaking, and actually not being able to discuss those needs and those essential needs covered is what is influencing the acknowledgement of this exercise of democratic participation of women and girls mainly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Yeah, if you close the space, how do you participate and make this part of the democratic process? Thank you. Let's turn to you, Akilah.
Thank you so much, Seema. And I think, really picking up on where Amanda just commented, to me, you can look at this connection between SRHR and democracy at two different levels, right? The individual and the institutional. So first, to the individual, and this is really, a lot of what Amanda was saying, decades of data has shown us that abortion access and the ability to control reproduction is directly connected to the ability to participate equally in civic and economic life. And that those who have the capacity to be pregnant rely on abortion access to plan their reproductive, economic, and social lives. And so the importance of this ability to control reproduction has also really come to light during COVID. We've seen the toll that unpaid care work has taken on women, and that staggering numbers have left the workforce. One study found that 3.5 million mothers with school-aged children this year in the United States lost jobs, took leaves of absence, or left the labor market altogether in the wake of the pandemic. And this is why, by the way, abortion is recognized not as a single right as such under international human rights framework, but rather its protections are drawn from a myriad of rights, ranging from health to equality to life, in recognition of the fact that sexual and reproductive rights are woven into the entirety of the framework for fundamental rights. And so to me, in this way, a democracy that fails to uphold the equality and rights of half of its population is a failing one. And I think we can also take this up to the institutional level. We see a direct correlation between the countries that are taking steps to restrict gender-related rights, abortion and other reproductive rights, such as those related to family size, rights and protections for LGBTQI+ individuals, and rising authoritarianism. And these are often the first rights that are restricted and used to control populations that are disfavored by those in power: women, gender diverse people, sexual minorities, as well as other minority populations, right? And we saw this, these issues were the laser focus of the Trump administration, as they are of other authoritarian leaders in places like Hungary and in China. And just to kind of, conclude, as a part of this, our organization works on sexual and reproductive rights, but we also work on a range of issues related to gender equality, including peace and security. And we know from this work that gender equality is actually a predictor of peace and stability and the fall into conflict, as well as the length and intensity of conflict. So in this way, I think we can look at the resilience of democracy as something that is directly connected to how strong a country's protections for gender equality are. And as we know, gender equality is not possible without access to sexual and reproductive rights. So I'll stop here.
That's such a super helpful note, Akilah, because this is gendered, right? This is about people who reproduce. So Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Seema and Helena and Amanda. This is so really powerful to be with you all. So for me, the defining characteristic of a democratic society is the opportunity for all its members to participate economically, politically, and socially. Access to healthcare, and for women, girls, and gender diverse people, especially access to sexual and reproductive healthcare that includes abortion, is critical to ensuring all individuals can fully participate in their societies. So that's why sexual and reproductive rights is so fundamental to democracy. And it's why the US must center sexual and reproductive rights in its efforts to strengthen democracy in the US and globally. And I was so happy, Helena, opening up with the global Gag Rule, because there isn't anything much more undemocratic than the global Gag Rule. And as she said, it's a policy where the US government attached to our global health assistance that dictates what what organizations can do in other countries with their non-US money. And it's really egregious because it does interfere, as Helena said so well, with the sovereignty of nations. So as the first Summit for Democracy convenes, I want to congratulate President Biden and Vice President Harris for taking an important step towards supporting the human rights of women and girls and ensuring the US does its part to support countries' efforts to move closer to the democratic ideal of bodily autonomy and access to sexual and reproductive health care by repealing the global gag rule. And when President Biden issued a presidential memorandum to repeal the policy back in January, he also established as official US policy support for sexual and reproductive health and rights of all people in the US and globally. And they didn't stop there. In October, the administration issued the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality and included among its top priorities protecting and advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights. So, and as such, the gender strategy includes a statement of policy from the administration calling for a permanent repeal of the global gag rule. And this is all to show that the US government understands that when the global gag rule is in place, it undercuts the efforts of governments and civil society around the world to protect the human rights and bodily autonomy of their citizens. And so these are just examples of how where you can have, you have these policies, they can be removed, but there's still this lingering effect on the people who it's impacted. And also, the commitment, we have a commitment from an administration to repeal these policies, and now we need to make it a reality. Women and girls are making historic strides around the world in many nations, as we know, and those countries benefit immeasurably from their contributions. But in many places, the lack of access to healthcare holds women and their families back, and ultimately their countries back. So if the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we are citizens of a global society, and that healthcare assistance is one of the most important ways the US contributes to the development and support of countries facing economic challenges and these global pandemics. So as Helena and others have been saying, repealing the global gag rule is critical to ensure that countries receiving US global health assistance are free to address their public health challenges with their own local public health and solutions. So repealing the global gag rule is not just a sexual reproductive rights issue, it's a global health issue, it's a human rights issue, free speech issue, fundamentally a democracy issues. So in closing, while the Democracy Summit is an opportunity for civil society and governments to bring to light how policies like these undercut democracy, the upcoming year of action will require us to take action and hold the US government and other governments accountable to ensure that the promise of democracy includes protection and promotion of sexual and reproductive health and rights for all.
And thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, it really struck me as somebody who lives in the United States that the first female vice president at their first commission on the status of women, she said, the status of women is the status of democracy. So we are seeing both actions and bold language out of the gate. Much more work to do. So let's stay on this topic because Sarah, you kind of laid out the fact that the Biden administration has been coming out of the gate strongly championing sexual and reproductive health and rights everywhere, the US, globally. But there continues to be these pre-existing, long-standing harmful policies in US foreign policy that stand in the way of fully realizing all of our vision on sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. And so you shared a little bit about the gag rule and its implications. Akilah, can you share about other policies? Unfortunately, there's more than just one.
Sure, happy to get this started. So yeah, Seema, we often talk about the global gag rule, and as we know, these are policies that are put in place by administrations, right? Presidential administrations, starting with President Reagan, but they are, they're supported and underlined by congressional restrictions that have existed for decades. So since 1973, the Helms Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act has been continuously in place and restricts the use of US money to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning or to motivate or coerce any person to practice abortion. And since the 1980s, the Cisgender Amendment, which we very rarely hear spoken about, actually prohibits lobbying for or against abortion. And so these two restrictions in concert together are continually applied to what can be done with US funding. And so whether or not the gag rule is in place, we have the impacts of the United States government trying to control, as Helena talked about, what happens in other nations, interfering in the sovereignty of other nations, shutting down the advocacy of the work of those in country who are prioritizing these issues. And so I think that component is really important to talk about. And in particular, the fact of the matter is when we often think about the gag rule or we think about these issues, we think about the constraints on free speech of, say, an individual doctor who's not able to counsel or provide information necessarily, which is perhaps a misinterpretation of these restrictions, but often how it's thought about, right? But in these contexts, for example, the Cisgender Amendment and the Helms Amendment, they apply to legislative reform. And they've in fact been used and enforced in processes that relate to legislative reform. And USAID is clear, actually. They have guidance that specifically reminds USAID staff that the subject of abortion can come up in non-health contexts, such as constitutional or other legislative reform. And we saw this play out in 2008, where there were investigations of all different types of activities that were funded by USAID around the Kenyan constitution, which aimed within Kenya to have exceptions added to the absolute criminalization of abortion in Kenya. We've also seen this be enforced more recently, and I really want to emphasize that here, the enforcement, the application is one that's done by both Republican and Democratic governments. So as we think and talk about what it means for the Biden administration to make real this commitment of saying that they're a champion for, sexual and reproductive rights, we really need to think about what they can do in this context. So 2 recent examples, one happened during the Trump administration, one happened just recently in the Biden administration. So in 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, announced that the U.S. was actually cutting assistance to the Organization of American States. The Trump administration was frustrated and upset that the human rights arm of the Organization of American States had made important recommendations in countries to decriminalize abortion, ensure access, and they found that to be a violation of the Cisgender Amendment. And they actually cut a portion of the money that was going to this institution, saying that their money was being used to lobby for and against abortion, which not only was a misapplication of the Cisgender Amendment, but it really shows the depth to which we misunderstand how the human rights framework works and what it is that human rights bodies and experts are set up to do. And more recently, under the Biden administration, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the UK, they were scheduled to present at a global health conference sponsored by USAID on the topic of, they're presenting factual data and information about telemedicine abortion. And the presentation was actually canceled in its entirety by USAID, citing potential violations of the Helms Amendment. And so what we see here is that factual information is being shut down, advocacy is being shut down, and as countries around the world are actually moving towards liberalizing their abortion laws, even as we here in the United States seem to be going in the opposite direction, I think we really need to think about what it means for the US to be a leader on human rights and democracy if we are not allowing human rights to take root in other countries, if we are interfering in the sovereignty and the democratic processes of other countries to stop their realization of human rights.
Yeah, but you spoke so eloquently, Akilah, about the chilling effect, right? There's the actual laws in the books and just how expansive they become because people are afraid of losing their critical funding. I want to turn to Helena and Amanda and then come back to Sarah, because for both Helena and Amanda, your work is directly impacted by these policies coming out of the United States and then the work that you do with colleagues and communities. So can you share a little bit more about how this violates individual rights, how it violates sovereignty, how it impacts the work you're doing and democracy building? And so, Amanda, maybe we'll start with you and then turn to Helena.
Sim, claro. Eu acredito que no Brasil,
Yes, of course. I believe that in Brazil, in particular, the ideological impact has been stronger. The Bolsonaro administration saw in the Trump administration an important ally against SRHR, and there's such a discourse which is racist and against women and against minorities. And although Trump is no longer in the government, we have this position in the current administration that has taken a leadership role in actions against the SRHR. There is, for example, the signature of the Geneva Declaration, and this was signed by Brazil denying the right to abortion. And it goes against something that it is promoted, but that is something that Bolsonaro is championing in Brazil, that abortion is not a right and that we have to advocate to repeal all these norms which are based in commitments engaged internationally by Brazil previously. So we are going to have this going back to previous legislation in terms of providing protection to families and women. So there is this discourse that abortion is not a right, and this came as a result of this leadership between Bolsonaro, Trump, and other countries. And I have to remind you that the Geneva Consensus is a very strong expression in the international arena against SRHR. And that's why we believe that the United States should take a position in this sense. It is a new government, but we know that the Helms Amendment and that the global Gag Rule, these are going to have a residual lingering effect in other countries. And what we will see is more unsafe abortions, unwanted pregnancy, and the United States allowed conservative alliances to be built to perpetuate such policies directly and indirectly, and also seen from the symbolic perspective, which was very heavily felt in Brazil. The language on sexual and reproductive rights in international agreements was felt here, and it is an objective of authoritarian regimes such as the one that we have in Brazil. And this is done locally to legitimate all these references to international agreements. Recently, we had a recommendation. It is a governmental recommendation that was published by the Ministry of Health, and it was a group, technical group, recommending that the rights already guaranteed in terms of SRHR, that these rights which are offered free to the population. And there was this recommendation which was repealed, and now the ones that have signed in favor of keeping it in effective were fired from the Ministry of Health. So that's what we have been seeing in terms of legitimating such actions in international spheres. And the Brazilian government is also trying to eliminate any efforts already consolidated in terms of SRHR. For example, the right to life since conception has already been included in a document that was signed by the government in an attempt to build this whole symbolic language which will legitimate such actions and repeal other rights that had been achieved in terms of reproductive rights for women. I think this is the impact.
Yeah, it legitimizes other anti-SRHR efforts, like you said, Amanda, and including from leadership within the context of Brazil. Thank you for sharing that. Helena.
Thank you. When the Gag Rule was reinstated by the Trump administration, it found the society, Mozambican society, enjoying a win. In 2014, there was the criminalization of abortion. And this only happened because we had hot debates. Even organization, women's rights organization, that they labeled themselves as a feminist organization. They had reservation on safe abortion. And we had to do research, get the numbers of deaths that resulted from unsafe abortion to convince people, held debates, and do a lot of work to ensure that we were in the same page, and the resistance was dimmed. And then there is this big country, nation that comes with a lot of money and tells us that maybe you didn't make the right decision. So all the wins that we had until that time were lost. And a big divide was created because organizations were strong enough to say, no, I will not sign the global Gag Rule, and I'll see how I can continue to do what I'm doing and serve my constituents. And the others say, well, I'll sign it because I need these funds so I can continue and do the work that I'm doing and somehow still benefit some women and girls, and making sure that, because it wasn't just sexual and reproductive health, it was WASH, it was nutrition, it was extended, it was stricter. So losing money from US government and not be able to serve all the population, the target population, it was something that some organizations did not even consider. So what happened is those organizations, I can give you an example of Women in Law in Southern Africa, they lost abruptly 7% of funding. They had to reduce people, and they had to not just comply with the planning on sexual and reproductive health for women and girls, but also they had worked with sexual workers. They stopped. They had worked with LGBT community. They stopped because the money was gone. All of a sudden, just because somebody went to their website and saw that they used to in past or they work on abortion work, and they promote safe abortion, and they were also involved in the group that managed to put a provision on penal code that allowed women in the right condition to have access to abortion. They lost their funding. So it created a divide and environment of fear, because even those who signed, they didn't want to be seen sitting in even events with those who didn't sign, because it was like they were prosecuted. If you were seen sitting with somebody belong to organization that did not sign the global Gag Rule, you are automatically promoting abortion as a family planning method. So it was something so devastating that we're still feeling the effects of it. And a study was done recently by an organization that did not sign the global Gag Rule, and they accounts how the work was affected and how the constituency was affected because of the fact that they resisted, and how they now are stigmatized and only now recovering because of this change on US administration. It was devastating to see that. And again, I say, when aid comes with strings attached, is it really aid, or it comes with other intention? Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Helena. I mean, groups are put in an impossible position, right? Either deny comprehensive care, and lose money, or keep the money, and then or try to continue with some of these other programs, but comply with not providing comprehensive care. So thank you so much for putting it out so bleakly and clearly. So we'll go to, I want to hear one last thought from Sarah, and then we're going to go to the audience. And Sarah, I'm going to go back to you because I wanted you to close your comment on the Gag Rule and also link it to a question that's come up from our audience, which is what's happening domestically in the United States with the Supreme Court, and how do you square, this American government that we have that's, making all kinds of decisions on these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Seema, and I appreciate the question. And, I think I think sadly, with the global gag rule over the past decades, it's become status quo, has largely, has with little challenge. I mean, in terms of those in power, it's just kind of taken for granted. It comes and goes depending on who's in office. And I think that creates a culture, it creates a norm when something like this lasts that long. And I think that's something important in the US gender strategy, is that it says policy isn't going to fix things alone. We need to shift norms, we need to shift culture. The gender policy, and why I really stress, lifting up the positives with this administration, is really to change the norms, to say, it's a new day, and to hold the government accountable that we need these policy changes, because then we as advocates can go back and really seek that change. And in terms of what's happening domestically, it's very important to note that a lot of this administration is, that I've really seen for the first time, really trying to connect that US and global. And I'm excited to hear the Ms. Catherine Baird's remarks from Canada, because they have done that. Their approach to foreign policy is like, what we want for women and girls and people globally, we want for that home. And I think we really need to enshrine that. So the backsliding that we're seeing in our courts with the government is really, these are all tied. Our foreign policy, what we're doing globally and domestically. And I think, and that's why it's so important that we put the pressure on the Biden-Harris administration to not just put these things down on paper about sexual reproductive health and rights and access to abortion. Here we say globally in the US, but let's lead by example. Let's develop for global democracies a model of what a strong, healthy, vibrant democratic society looks like by defending sexual reproductive health and rights through actions like codifying Roe by passing the Women's Health Protection Act. We have legislation to codify Roe. We have legislation to repeal the global gag rule, the global HER Act. So we need this administration to really embrace both those legislative actions and to put their force behind them, and do it in the name of democracy, in the name of really respecting people in other countries and governments, as Helena was saying, respect the sovereignty of other countries, and respect rights at home and abroad. I think pursuing a positive, proactive vision of advancing sexual reproductive rights and justice can also take the form of repealing Hyde and Helms. Again, we have Hyde restricts abortion in the US, Helms restricts abortions, funding for abortions globally. And let's bring these together, and let's, as advocates too, we have to come together. We can no longer, as in the US, I can speak only for the US, that we have those who work on domestic policy, those who work on foreign policy. And how can we link ourselves and build a movement where we ourselves, because if we want that from the government, we have to do that ourselves and come to the table together. And when we're fighting for abortion rights and access in the US, we can't leave women and girls and gender diverse people globally behind. This isn't America first. We need to bring everybody along when we're changing these policies, because the US government is too much of a force in the world as a leader in funding globally on health.
I think you put it so well, Sarah, like it's just as much about our work as advocates and how we hold our own government to account for those of us who live in the US. So I know Akilah wanted to make one addition here.
Yeah, no, I think, I agree with all what Sarah's saying. I think I might be a bit more cynical. Working in the global space, the Biden administration has just been given a lot of latitude for not being Trump, right? They've been able to reassert and say, we are now, we're back, we're global leaders, we're back on the Human Rights Council. But when you start digging into the substance, we still haven't seen them put much energy behind reproductive rights. You look at the situation here in the United States, you see what happened in the wake of the Supreme Court hearings. the administration hasn't said anything about what's happening in this country right now. You know, they've barely even said the word abortion. And so I think that while, yes, we should be encouraging, we should be pushing for the implementation of this commitment, I think it's also fair for us to call out and be critical, because it's just not enough in the state that we're currently facing to have good rhetoric anymore. And we can't just accept the US as a global leader when we're not showing ourselves to have anything that models global leadership. And so, you know, I think that as we think about, you know, the administration's line of, you know, the United States is back, or whatever it is that we're saying, you know, we have to do better, because I don't think that we can just rest on this presumption that just because we're not the Trump administration, we deserve praise. And so, you know, yes, you know, it's great to see the commitments, but there's so much more that needs to be done to make real these domestic and international commitments. And we have seen nothing really.
We have time for just our last question from the audience, and it's a question for all of our panelists. So we're going to do that and then try to see the remarks from the MC of Canada, which I'm so glad that we're able to hear from them. So this goes on your last point, Akilah, which is this Summit for Democracy that the United States is hosting, you know, happening today and tomorrow, is meant to be a stage setter, right, for a year of action. And what we expect to happen is that a year from now, next December, there will be another summit, hopefully in person, including the US and many countries around the world, where governments and other entities will be expected to make commitments about strengthening democracy. So I'd like to ask all the panelists what commitments you would like countries to make, the US, your own country, any other countries during the summit. And if there are any actions in the intervening time from now, you know, leading up to next year's summit, what are some priority actions you want a government to take? So I'm going to go start with Helena.
Thank you, Seema. I think there is from the US government, there is already an ask. Like I said, there was a study done, and one of the recommendations that civil society organizations, especially those who work on SRHR and gender justice and women's rights area, is that there is no possibility of reinstatement of the global Gag Rule. So we cannot be held hostage on this change of this administration. So for me, that will be a win already. And from our government and other governments, it's just the beautiful laws and the progressive laws, policies and strategies that you have nationally, that you have domesticated from regional and international bodies are implemented. And for us, we didn't get a chance to talk about a little bit about Mozambique commitment to SRHR and to gender justice and women's rights. But if you look to our legal framework in relation to women's rights, girls' rights, you will see that we are not short of anything. But then the implementation, it is short. There is no necessary investments. There is no data collection that you can rely on. There is no political will to implement the laws. So if we manage to implement what we already have, even without making any review, it's already a win. So it's a start. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
It was so powerful. Here on permanent end to the global Gag Rule, and in a sense, sometimes just implementing the laws that we already have and fully realizing them. Amanda.
Bom, acho que nós gostaríamos que os Estados Unidos assumissem, né?
We would like for the US to take on the commitment, the active commitment of promoting access to secure abortion, because beyond the global Gag Rule, it depends on politicians. We don't have the certainty that it's going to come back at some point. So we have to make sure that those kind of policies definitely do not exist again, but to impede all administrations to stop this cooperation with women, to promote the health of women that are dying every year in some of the safest countries in the world regarding human rights, and at this moment where the pandemic is showing the importance of solidarity among countries, there is no longer space for policies that try to impose religious rules that will violate the rights of women and other situations of vulnerability against sexual and reproductive rights. So we believe it's necessary to remove any and all restrictions that would increase mother mortality in terms of unsafe abortions, and understanding that in the US we have some of the best and longest planning, family planning, and how women are depending on some of this support everywhere for their overall sexual and reproductive health. So only the promotion of those services based on human rights and not local establishments on the health of women to be able to actually promote the right to life, reducing the number of unwanted pregnancies and improving safety in abortion. So the access to abortion we believe to be very important, safe abortion, and funding, promoting solidarity among countries to reduce the number of unsafe abortions and mother deaths is something that should be very clear in this commitment with democracy and acknowledging the basic needs of all people.
It seems like a pretty obvious thing to be on board on preventing.
Parece bastante óbvio realmente
Thank you
ter
so much,
que adotar essas medidas. Muito
Akilah.
obrigada. Akilah.
I think you may be on mute, Akilah.
Acho que eu fiquei aqui
Right, I am.
mutada.
And I think the Portuguese translation might be happening on the English channel. I'll just note that quickly. Thank you. I'll be very brief. So one is, I think, an ask that's also on the table. So during the Universal Periodic Review of the United States in 2019, the US received 12 recommendations that related to improving access to sexual and reproductive health care and rights, and addressing in particular the exceptions to the Helms Amendment. So the Biden administration has the ability unilaterally to allow the exceptions that are permitted by Congress for rape, life endangerment, and incest that are currently not actually being applied to the way the Helms Amendment is enforced. And that is something that, we had over 140 organizations join in asking the Biden administration to make this a priority action in the last year. We haven't seen any action yet. And so I think that's one very easy thing that they can do, and this doesn't touch Congress. I also think that we need to see stronger federal leadership on these issues, stronger federal leadership on issues like Helms, as well as on the Hyde Amendment. And I think we're hoping to see the administration really, do more. And then I think the final thing really goes to something that both Amanda and Helena were talking about, which is the real need at this point in time to be strengthening this global architecture that connects all of us of rights, and to really be making sure that all states, Canada, the Netherlands, not only in their commitments, not only in the way that they fund that they're funding access to reproductive rights, that they're funding access to abortion, but that they do so in a way that makes it clear that they're doing this to be in compliance with international human rights law. We need to strengthen this architecture that's under attack in all different ways. And it's incredibly important to strengthen it, and as Helena said, domesticate it down in every country level.
Yeah, we have a guidepost. It's international human rights law. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, just at a bare minimum, I think we all agree the Biden-Harris administration needs to use all of its tools to shepherd a permanent repeal of the global gag rule through the Congress, really to end this 40 years of interference. And I would also add a couple of things. One is I would add a public apology for this interference, for the harm caused by the global gag rule. This is something that is so egregious, as we've heard. So I think a public apology. I think also let's get a champion in the White House on sexual reproductive health and rights. I think This has been a perpetual problem across administrations where you have, we have a gender policy council now in the White House. We're going to have an ambassador at large in the Office of Global Women's Issues at State Department. We really need to make it clear at a highest level who is going to really make sure that the promise of sexual reproductive health and rights in the US and globally is going to be fulfilled. Implementation plans for the gender strategy must include sexual reproductive health and rights. Every agency, every bureau should be required to have sexual reproductive health and rights if we truly see it as an issue of democracy. And then, and as I was saying, supporting permanent gag rule of the national gender strategy. Statements without real policy change are not enough. And so we really want to see action from this administration. I think there's a lot that they can do over the next year and this year of action to show their commitment to SRHR as a democracy issue.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I think making it concrete is the way we can be supportive as advocates. I'm so glad we were able to hear from the Embassy of Canada. Thank you so much to Catherine Baird and for everyone for staying a little bit past our concluding time. Hopefully it was a good way to end on a high note, that this is possible, it's feasible. There are governments that are leading the way, and there's such a global community around us that is going to continue to protect our rights and push for full realization. So thank you so much to Amanda, to Helena, to Sarah, and to Akilah, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. This is the beginning of more to come, so stay tuned, and until next time, and happy holidays. Thank you for joining us.